I am Maria Luisa Camagay, Professor Emeritus of the Department of History, and the paper that I will share this morning is entitled The Hilot of the Philippines and the Dukun Bayi Compared. While reading the book of Lisbeth Hessling entitled Healers on the Colonial Market, Native Doctors and Midwives in the Dutch East Indies, I was struck by the similarity of experience of the Hilot of the Philippines and the Dukun Bayi in the Dutch East Indies or present-day Indonesia. Both terms refer to the traditional midwife of the Philippines and the Dutch Indies. This piqued my interest to document the perception of the colonial authorities on them, especially when both the Spaniards and the Dutch were keen on introducing Western medicine in their respective colonies. Both colonials were eager in establishing a school of midwifery which would graduate professional midwives to take care of the health needs of the pregnant woman. This move would result in a confrontation between the traditional midwife and the professional midwife. This short paper explores the experience of the Hilot and the Dukun Bayi during the colonial periods of the Philippines and Indonesia. First, so this is a picture of a traditional Hilot in the Philippines and the Dukun Bayi in the Netherlands East Indies. First, let us define the terms of Hilot and Dukun Bayi. The term Hilot in Tagalog refers to a birth attendant or a native midwife who uses massaging techniques to properly position the uterus of the pregnant woman in order to facilitate delivery of the baby. The Dukun Bayi, on the other hand, would be a Javanese woman who assists in the delivery of the babies and who provide prenatal and postnatal care to mothers. The Dukun Bayi would be called Paraji in the Sunda area and Dukun Beranak in East Java. In 19th century Europe, the fields of midwifery and public health were on center stage. Midwifery was then associated with witchcraft, possibly due to the fact that women who attended to pregnant women were old. The concern for public health came from the fact that most of the midwives were coming from the poorer class and were perceived to be lacking in knowledge of hygiene, endangering, as a result, the health of the mother and the child. It was in this context that Europeans sought to establish a school of midwifery which would professionalize the practice of midwifery. This became the thrust of European colonials in their respective colonies, the Spaniards in the Philippines and the Dutch in the Dutch East Indies. The School of Midwifery was established by the Spaniards in 1879, which was attached to the School of Medicine and Pharmacy of the University of Santo Tomas. The Dutch, on the other hand, approved the establishment of a training school for midwives in 1850, 29 years earlier than the Philippines. The Spanish authority justified the establishment of a school of midwifery by citing the supposed inhuman and rough way the Hilots attended pregnant women. Mention was made of the following practices resorted to by the Hilot to expedite the delivery of babies. One, the pregnant woman is hung by the hair during prolonged labor. Two, the pregnant woman is made to go up and down the house via the window. Three, the partera exerts pressure against the belly of the pregnant woman to expel the baby. Four, the partera forcibly pulls the protruding part of the baby, example, an arm or an any extremity which appears. And five, the partera pulls the umbilical cord violently to the point of breaking the cord. The above practices may be exaggerations so as to give urgency to the establishment of a school of midwifery by the Spaniards. In other words, for the Spaniards, the raison d'etre was the supposed inhuman treatment of the helots to pregnant women. In the case of the Dukun Bayi, the colonial records referred to them uh, as incompetent, ignorant, and exposed women in childbirth and unborn child to the greatest mortal danger. The head of the medical service, Bosch, invoked the ignorance of the Dukun Bayi and the risk for women in childbirth to justify the 1850 opening of the School of Midwifery in the Dutch East Indies. It was not a big help that Europeans brought with them in their colonies the low regard given to midwives in Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries, wherein a midwife was depicted as having lower intelligence and even lower morals. The civil physician of Kediri, H.B. van Buren, led a crusade against the Dukun Bayi, referring to her as the native angel of death. MP Van Kool, who shared the same view, remarked, most of them looked unhealthy, stupid, dirty, and one had advanced syphilis. They messed about with some speed and magical formulas and fitted the women in labor with dirty hands and dirty clothes and kitchen utensils. In short, by the 19th century, the idea of modernization introduced by the European colonials was to bring about a scientific-based knowledge of childbirth. In fact, it was during this period that gynecology was an emerging field in medicine. Scientific motherhood was now a buzzword in the colonies of the Philippines and the Dutch Indies. The establishment of a school of midwifery was recognized as imperative in both colonies. The Hilot and Dukun Bayi shared the following qualities. One, both were generally old women. Uh, in colonial Philippines, the average age of the Hilot in the Arabales of Manila was 57 years old. Apparently, age mattered in this profession. Age also was a measure of experience in the practice of the profession. The Dukun Bayi was also described as an elderly woman who was, because of her advanced age rather, suggested that she had assisted in many deliveries and was rich in her knowledge of childbirth. Both the Hilot and the Dukun Bayi acquired their skills of delivering babies from their mother or grandmothers or even mother-in-law. In other words, it was a skill passed on from relatives. Three, both were considered native healers who, by their age and experience, were preferred by the native population of women. Four, both tolerated the observance of native practices attendant to the delivery of babies. In the Philippines, one of the customs observed when the delivery of baby was the hanging of garlic in the doorway of the house of the mother to drive off evil spirits. The husband with his bolo would be stationed outside the house and with his bolo swings the air with the intent of warding off evil spirits. Once the placenta has been expelled, the healer traps it with objects which would bring good fortune to the baby and either buries it or is thrown into the river. In the case of the Dutch East Indies, the Dukun Bayi allowed the practice of adat or customary law. Garlic also was hung in the entrance of the house, presumably for the same reason as that in the Philippines, which is to drive away the evil spirits. The husband may be present to assist by supporting his wife's head and neck. If he is indisposed, he is represented by a rice pestle or bolster dressed like a doll. Once the placenta is expelled, the Dukun Bayi wraps it and accompanies it with articles that will bring good fortune to the baby, but in most cases with salt, with the belief that the baby would not lack anything in life. Both were considered insiders of the community, which made them acceptable to pregnant women. Both the Hilot and the Dukun Bayi use the therapeutic touch of the massage. In the Philippines, the very word of Hilot, referring to the traditional midwife, refers also to a practitioner who uses the massage to facilitate the delivery of the baby. With these advantages presented by the Hilot and Dukun Bayi, it was no surprise that the native women preferred them over the licensed midwife. Uh, This leads us to some descriptions of the Hilot and Dukun Bayi during the colonial period of both the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. In the Philippines, mention of the Hilot may be found in accounts of foreign visitors of the country in the 19th century. A French visitor of the Philippines who visited the country in the 19th century witnessed a woman who fainted while in labor being tied to the foot of the table by her hair in order to regain consciousness. The efficacy of this procedure was documented by John Mala, who was a doctor himself. Mala observed, if a woman is in childbed, has a fainting fit or uterine hemorrhage, they pull their hair with force. We have seen one example of the efficacy of this practice. One day we were fetched for a woman in birth pains who was having convulsions similar to epilepsy. While waiting for our arrival, she was attached by the hair to the foot of the table and we saw her regain consciousness without needing other help. The seemingly inhuman treatment observed by Mala convinced him of the efficacy of the method resorted to by the Hilot. In fact, Mala referred to the latter as the Mabuting Hilot or the good midwife. He mentions that the Mabuting Hilot is usually an old woman and is rich in experience. He added, they are never embarrassed. With assurance, they solve the most difficult cases and the most arduous questions. Even when pregnancy dates only several weeks, they hardly hesitate to announce the sex of the child, and they are unthinkingly consulted in this important question. Mala, however, declared barbarous the practice of the Hilot in applying hot bricks on the stomach of the woman in labor and exerting pressure downwards to hasten the delivery of the baby. Fyodor Yegor, a German scholar who visited the Philippines in 1859 to 1860, mentioned that when the pregnant woman is in labor, windows are closed and every opening in the house is closed so that the evil spirit called the Patyana may not enter and delay the delivery of the baby or cause harm to the baby. This particular evil spirit feeds on the entrails of the newborn baby. For Yegor, the enclosed room was not healthy and concluded that it aggravated the state or condition of the woman in labor. A British visitor of the Philippines, John Bowring, who was governor of Hong Kong, arrived in the Philippines in 1859 and documented what he saw and learned about the Philippines. His documentation of the Mabuting Hilot appears in his book, A Visit to the Philippine Islands. The Mabuting Hilot is described in a negative light as her practice are described as barbarous. Bowring wrote thus, barbarous practices are frequently associated with parturition. The Mabuting Hilot or the good midwife is called in. If the birth is delayed, witches are supposed to be the cause, and their dispersion is effected by the explosion of gunpowder from a bamboo cane close to the head of the sufferer. The newborn infant is laid on a mat or pillow and exposed to the air to facilitate the escape of evil influences from the body, which is brought about by burning 3 wax tapers placed on the 2 cheeks and chin of the baby, often to its great peril. In the case of the Dukun Bayi, descriptions of them uh, uh, from colonial records in arguing the necessity of establishing a training school for midwives. Just like the Philippines, the rough treatment of the Dukun Bayi to the women in labor were justified in setting up the school. The head of the medical service, Bosch, mentioned the ignorance of the Dukun Bayi as well as the risk for women in childbirth. And we see also Bush writing the ill treatment that they are subjected to at the time, to understand the harm this inflicts on the population. Bush would continue that women had no choice but be subjected to the rough treatment of the Dukun Bayi. Successors of Bosch in the medical service repeated the argument that the Dukun Bayi was ignorant of normal childbirth and would be helpless in handling emergencies. Health officers and European physicians continued the demonization of the Dukun Bayi since their observations were just repetitions. Despite attempts to marginalize the traditional midwives, they were still preferred by Native women, and the reasons for this are found are based on the following. Both traditional healers were preferred because of age. Age was equated to someone who was rich in experience and a wealth of knowledge. Respect and deference to old women were qualities present in Asian societies, unlike in the Western countries where old women were often mistaken as witches. It is from this belief that Europeans demonized the traditional midwives in their society and which they would carry over in their colonies in Asia. Another advantage of both the Hilot and the Dukun Bayi was their being part of the community. We might say that they were insiders of the community and therefore pregnant women were more comfortable with them. Furthermore, the native women trusted them more than the licensed midwife in the Philippines or the trained midwife in the Netherlands East Indies. This was evident in the case of the matrona titular or the licensed midwives in 19th century Philippines. Licensed midwives were required to report the number of births that they assisted, and one is surprised with a few numbers. Moreover, the matrona titular is oftentimes assigned in a community which is not their own. In short, we can say that she is coming from the cold. The respect for customary law or adat by the Dukun Bayi as well as by the traditional midwife um, made them preferred by the native women. The indigenous women were very attached to the familiar Dukun Bayi with their knowledge of customs observed during childbirth. An example was the cutting of the umbilical cord with a sharpened bamboo knife. The Dukun Bayi gave the newly born baby and mother their bath. The baby's navel is treated and covered with an umbilical bandage, while the mother is bathed, rubbed with herbs, with her abdomen tightly girded. In the case of the Filipino Hilot, Mala mentions that after delivery, the mother is given water and rice porridge, which Mala names as basa-basa, and is described as sugared rice floating in water in which it was cooked. During labor, according to Mala, the woman is surrounded with the most sacred objects such as a crucifix, images of the Virgin Mary and saints, as well as candles to inspire her to have courage. Here is an instance where the Catholic faith enters traditional maternity practice. Mala adds that a cord is applied below the womb of the mother to prevent hemorrhage. Apart from the Hilot and the Dukun Bayi respecting indigenous customs of childbirth, both did not impose exorbitant fees or fees for their services. The Dukun Bayi would usually receive what a pregnant woman could afford, which is often in kind, a chicken, a rug, a cup of coffee, or half a ganta of rice. The Hilot may offer her services for free, especially if they are relatives. But if paid, they would often be paid in kind. With the Hilot and the Dukun Bayi, the pregnant woman was assured of prenatal, delivery, and postnatal care. What distinguished the Hilot and the Dukun Bayi from the trained midwife was the postnatal care which they provided the new mother. The Dukun Bayi often remained to help out for 40 days, not only caring for the mother and child, but also doing household chores. The same was true of the Hilot in the Philippines. The fact that she was willing to do household chores while the mother recuperates became one of the reasons for her services. She administered postpartum care to the mother and help in the household chores until such time the mother regained her strength. All of the above reasons were why the native women preferred the traditional midwife. How did the colonial authorities try to win pregnant women from the clutches of the traditional midwife? The solution provided by the colonial authorities in the Philippines and in the Dutch East Indies was to establish a school of midwifery. Despite this, the native women persisted in availing the services of the traditional midwife. In the Philippines, the licensed midwife was encouraged by the reglamento or rules governing the profession of midwifery to report to the authorities a Hilot. In 1887, Doña Nicolasa Francisco, a matrona titular or licensed midwife, filed a complaint against Maria de Guzman, a traditional midwife. It was found out that Maria de Guzman had been punished twice for attending to the delivery of the wife of Blas Mateo. Twice de Guzman was imprisoned at the Carcel de Bilibid. This time, de Guzman was fined 125 pesetas, a fine which was imposed on individuals who practiced the profession without license. Another action attempted by the matrona titular to eliminate the intrusas or intruders in the profession was for the church to deny the sacrament of baptism to the baby unless a certification was presented that the baby was delivered by a licensed midwife. The municipal doctor and subdelegate of medicine and surgery of the province of Manila felt that Article 14 of the Reglamento governing the matronas titulares sufficed. Article 14 read, the matronas will inform the corresponding authorities about the improper machinations carried out by the quacks. The authorities will investigate the person or persons referred to, as well as investigate the harm inflicted on the pregnant woman and the fetus. The said authorities will also mete out the deserved punishment. In the case of the Dukun Bayi, the certified midwife tried to impose preference for her by matching her fee with that of the Dukun Bayi or tolerating a few added customs. Another approach was when administrators gave support to the certified midwife so as to set an example to the local women. In Puwakarta, this succeeded when the native heads saw the resident was squarely behind the midwife. They called her for assistance, after which the population followed suit. However, this was not the case in Yogyakarta and Surakarta. Despite the use of the licensed midwives for women in the court, ordinary women continued to patronize the Dukun Bayi. Clearly, the popularity of the Dukun Bayi persisted during the colonial period. Concluding, the role played by the traditional midwife in the colonial period of the Philippines and the Dutch Indies was deeply embedded in the native society. The advantages offered by the traditional midwife in both countries could not be matched by the licensed and trained midwife. The services they offered was complete and total and respectful of the social and cultural milieu of the pregnant native women. It appears that Southeast Asia had an altogether different view of maternal and child care. A strong bond existed between the traditional midwife and the native woman, a bond based on trust. It is in this light that it would be interesting to undertake a collaborative research among Southeast Asian countries on the role of the traditional midwife in their respective societies. Shared perspectives may emerge about them. Thank you.